My name is Maria Santos, and what I am about to tell you is not to seek applause, but because what I experienced in Dubai changed everything I thought I knew about how the hand of God moves. I come from a place where the roads turn to mud when it rains, where my mother sang hymns with a terrible voice but a giant heart, teaching me that He doesn't care about the tuning, but about honesty. I took that weight of faith with me when I decided to leave my children, Carlo and Isabel, to cross the ocean. I remember the physical pain in my chest, seeing their faces at the airport, the crying of my little girl clinging to my legs, and the broken gaze of my husband, Rodrigo. I felt hollow, as if the center of my soul had been scooped out with a spoon. On the plane, as the lights of Manila grew small, I squeezed the photo of my family and whispered for forgiveness, not knowing that the desert was waiting to show me a mystery that still today, when I close my eyes, makes me tremble with wonder and peace. Before continuing, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Turn on the bell so you don't miss any testimonies, and let us know in the comments where you are listening from. It is very important to have you participating in this community. Now, let's get back to the testimony. Dubai seemed like a planet made of lights and mirrors, a place where buildings touch the sky and luxury makes you feel tiny. The Al Rashid family home was not a house. It was a palace of white marble and gold where my footsteps were barely heard. At first, I was invisible, a shadow cleaning shiny floors and preparing tea in silence. I followed Madame Fatima's strict rules. No noise, no pork, no talking about my faith openly. My refuge was a small cleaning room, smelling of detergent and disinfectant, where I sat on an overturned bucket to read my Bible hidden in my pillow. There, between the hum of the air conditioning and the deepest loneliness I have ever felt, I spoke to God with the fear of being discovered, but with the urgency of someone who is drowning. I didn't understand why I was there, in the midst of a culture that felt foreign and cold to me, until the silence of that palace was torn apart by an event that brought death and life face to face. Everything changed on a Thursday night. I had spent the day carrying heavy sheets, and exhaustion weighed on my bones, but Mr. Ahmed had important guests, and everything had to be perfect. The air smelled of lamb, spices, and dates. Suddenly, a dry thud came from the dining room, followed by urgent shouts in Arabic that made my blood run cold. I ran alongside Linda and saw Mr. Ahmed on the floor, gray, with his eyes half open but empty, as if he were no longer there. Madame Fatima's scream was something I will never forget, a sound that came from the depths of her chest, raw and desperate, that no wealth can comfort. In a second, chaos took over. They loaded him into the car while guests called doctors, and the house, once so controlled, became an echo of anguish. We were left alone in the kitchen, surrounded by half-empty plates and the weight of death haunting the marble corridors, unaware that in that darkness, my faith would become the only bridge. At the hospital, under those white lights that seemed to strip you of any privacy, the family was sinking in pain. I stayed in a corner of the hallway, trying not to get in the way, feeling the cold of the air conditioning and the tension of news that didn't arrive. When the doctors came out, their faces said it all. The infection was winning, organs were failing, and the end was inevitable. I saw the children cry, and Madame Fatima walked down the corridor with her shoulders slumped by a weight she could no longer carry. At that moment, I felt a jolt in my spirit, a whisper that wasn't a voice, but was clear. Pray for him. It wasn't my own thought. It was a command that made my hands sweat. I hid in the hospital supply room, amidst the smell of alcohol and gauze, and got on my knees on the cold floor. I didn't say an elegant prayer. I screamed inside for that man's life, asking Jesus to show his mercy in a place where no one expected his name. That night, upon returning from the hospital, the silence in the mansion was so thick it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Madame Fatima went up the stairs leaning on her daughter, moving as if she were made of glass, broken by the news that her husband would not make it past dawn. I locked myself in my room, but sleep was an impossible idea. I felt a pressure in my chest, a fire burning inside me that forced me to get up. I went barefoot to the small supply room, sat on my plastic bucket surrounded by mops and detergents, and closed my eyes with a force that made my temples ache. I didn't ask for myself, nor for my family in the Philippines. I asked for Mr. Ahmed with a desperation I had never felt before, talking to God as if he were right in front of me in that dark storage room. I told him that this man had treated me like a person when others saw me as a shadow, and that his family needed him. I prayed until my words became a constant murmur, feeling the cold air of the storage room turn warm, almost solid, wrapping me in a peace that defied all medical logic. At dawn, the atmosphere of the house changed with a sharp blow, like when the wind changes direction before a storm. I was in the kitchen preparing coffee that no one seemed to want to drink, when I heard fast, urgent footsteps coming down the marble stairs. Madame Fatima appeared in the doorway, her phone trembling in her hand and her face pale, but her eyes were no longer dimmed by death. They were dilated by the purest wonder. The hospital had called to say that, inexplicably, Mr. Ahmed's vital signs had stabilized during the early morning, and that the infection, which was previously devouring his body, was receding at a speed the doctors could not understand. The sound of cries of despair was replaced by shouts of joy and praises in Arabic that filled every corner of the mansion. I stood still by the counter, my heart leaping in my ribs, knowing in the depths of my being that what had happened in that supply room had not been in vain, even if no one else knew. During the following week, Mr. Ahmed's recovery was the only topic of conversation, a miracle that doctors called spontaneous remission, because they had no other word in their books to explain the sacred. The house filled with flowers, relatives, and an air of relief that was felt in every room. But I kept moving in the shadows, dusting the gold frames, and serving tea as if nothing had happened. However, I felt the gazes. Madame Fatima watched me in a different way, a long, silent gaze that followed me as I mopped the living room. It wasn't the gaze of a boss checking work, but of someone searching for an answer in another person's face. I lowered my head, staying true to my role as an invisible maid, but inside I felt the ground beneath my feet shaking. The peace I felt was so great that sometimes I felt like crying with joy while washing dishes, thanking God for having heard the cry of a simple woman from Mindanao in the middle of a Dubai palace. The moment Mr. Ahmed returned home was like seeing someone return from the dead. He was thinner, walked slowly, and his voice was barely a thread, but there was something in his eyes I had never seen before, a depth, a humility that replaced his old businessman's rigidity. That same afternoon, while I was preparing some dates in the kitchen, Madame Fatima entered alone and stood by the wooden table, looking at me without saying a word for what felt like centuries. There was no noise in the kitchen, only the hum of the refrigerator and the beat of my own heart. Finally, she approached, gently took my hands, something she had never done in months, and asked me with a broken voice what I was doing in that hospital hallway when no one was watching. She asked me who I was talking to with such urgency, and why. Despite the tragedy, I seemed to have a light that they could not find. My tongue felt heavy. The fear of being fired fought against the truth, but the fire in my chest won the battle. I told her the truth, with my heart beating against my ribs like a caged bird and my damp hands hidden in the folds of my uniform. I confessed to her that in that hospital and in every corner of her house I spoke to Jesus, that I asked him for her husband's life with the same strength with which I asked for my children's bread in Mindanao. The silence that followed was so heavy it could almost be touched. Madame Fatima did not move, did not scream, nor did she order me out of her sight. She stayed there, her dark eyes fixed on mine, processing that her miracle came from a prayer made in a name that her tradition considered a sacrilege. I felt a paralyzing fear, thinking that in that instant everything would end, that I would be put on a plane back and lose my family's livelihood. But what I saw on her face was not hatred, but a confusion so deep it broke my soul. She looked at me as if for the first time she saw a human being under the fabric of my servant's hijab, someone who possessed a treasure that she, with all her millions and her lineage, could not understand or reach today. She then told me something that made my skin crawl and still keeps me awake at night. Mr. Ahmed, upon waking from his deep coma, had asked her a strange question. He wanted to know who the woman was who had been praying in his room during the early morning, a woman who spoke in a language he did not know but who brought him a peace that restored his breath. Madame Fatima had assured him that no one had entered the intensive care unit, that the doctors and nurses only spoke Arabic or English, and that no strange woman had been there. However, he insisted that he felt the warmth of invisible hands and the sound of a plea that broke the darkness of his unconsciousness. Hearing this, I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew that my prayers in the supply room, meters away, had pierced the concrete walls and the limits of the physical. God had sent his comfort directly to that man's spirit, and Madame Fatima, connecting the dots, looked at me with a respect bordering on reverent fear, understanding that something sacred had seeped into her home. A few days later, Mr. Ahmed summoned me to his private office, an imposing room filled with dark wood shelves, Arabic calligraphy in gold frames, and the scent of an expensive perfume I didn't know how to name. He was sitting behind a marble desk, looking still fragile, but with a renewed authority in his clear eyes. He asked me to sit down, breaking again all the protocols that Linda had taught me so rigorously since I arrived. He looked at me fixedly, and with a voice that still carried the weariness of death, asked me what God it was that I served with such devotion. He told me he was a businessman, a man of realities and numbers, but that what he had experienced in the hospital did not belong to this world. He wanted to know why a simple foreign woman would care so much about his life, someone who barely knew him and did not share his blood or his faith. I told him about the compassion that Jesus put in my heart, about how my mother taught me that the pain of others is our own pain in the eyes of God. The air in the room felt charged, electric. It wasn't a conversation between boss and employee. It was an encounter between two souls touched by a miracle. From that day on, the atmosphere in the Al-Rashid mansion transformed into something I cannot describe with common words, but with sensations of wonder and constant vigil. I was no longer just the maid wiping glass tables. I became a kind of silent confidant, someone Madame Fatima looked to for comfort without saying a word. We began to have brief but intense conversations in the kitchen before the rest of the family woke up, where she asked me how it was possible for me to have so much peace, being so far from my children and working so hard. I told her about hope, that my God was not in a statue or a distant idea, but that he walked with me among the detergent and mops of that palace. She listened with a thirst that scared me, a thirst that money and power had not been able to quench in all her life of luxury. The house felt different, as if a door had opened just a crack, letting in a light that began to illuminate the shadows of that palace in the desert, a secret that began to grow beneath our routine. The youngest daughter, Amira, who had studied in London and was very modern, started looking for me too. She didn't come with authority, but with a curiosity that seemed like pain. One day, she followed me to the laundry room, a place where the steam from the machines and the smell of soap filled everything, and asked me if I was truly happy. I looked at that young woman who had everything, designer clothes, jewelry, travel, and saw a void that no fortune in Dubai could fill. I explained to her, in my simple countrywoman way, that the peace I felt didn't come from my salary or where I was, but from knowing I was loved by someone who didn't see my bank account, but my heart. Amira cried right there among the white sheets I was folding, and I realized that the seed God had planted in that house through her father's healing was beginning to sprout in places I never imagined. It was powerful to see that rich girl seeking something that I, a simple Filipino maid, had in abundance within me by grace. But not everything was peace in that marble palace. The eldest son, Khaled, began to look at me with a suspicion that gave me chills. He was a serious man, very tied to traditions and family pride, and you could feel that he noticed the change in the air. During dinners, the silence was tense, and the way he observed me while I served food made me want to disappear into the floor. He started asking sharp questions about why his mother spent so much time in the kitchen talking to me, or why his father now spoke so much of mercy and forgiveness instead of business. I felt danger lurking around my room at night, the fear of being reported or causing an irreparable division in that family that, despite everything, had welcomed me. It was an invisible spiritual war happening in the luxurious hallways of Dubai, and I, who only wanted to earn my living, found myself in the middle of a whirlwind where God's light bothered those who preferred the shadow of old certainties and absolute control. I remembered my mother's words back in the Philippines about God sending us to places where we don't want to go because He has a job for us. On those hot Dubai nights, where the sound of the air conditioning was my only company, I lost sleep thinking about the responsibility that had fallen into my lap. I am not a preacher. I have no education. I am just a mother who misses her children. But there, in that palace, I was the only one carrying the message they so desperately needed to hear. The weight of it sometimes made me cry hidden in the bathroom, asking for strength not to falter and wisdom not to be reckless. I saw Mr. Ahmed trying to understand the Bible he now read in secret on the computer, and Madame Fatima asking me to read psalms to her in a low voice while I ironed her silk tunics. It was a double life that exhausted me, but at the same time gave me a strong purpose. I was not just Maria who cleaned the floor. I was a witness to something that was shaking that palace. The most marking moment was when Madame Fatima, on an afternoon when the house was empty, took me to her secret garden, a place surrounded by high walls with water fountains and flowers that looked plastic because they were so perfect. She sat on a stone bench and, with eyes full of tears, asked me to pray with her right there, out loud, the way I prayed in the hospital. My heart almost stopped. Praying out loud in an open garden in Dubai, in the name of Jesus, was something that could cost me my freedom. But when I looked at her face, I saw a thirsty woman, desperate for a touch from God, that her recited prayers were not reaching. I held her thin, well-cared-for hands with my hands calloused from work, and cried out to the Holy Spirit with an authority I didn't know I possessed. The wind blew through the palm trees, and a sacred silence fell over both of us. In that instant, there was no boss or servant, only two daughters of God seeking the Father's face. She sobbed softly, and I felt something hard break. After that moment in the garden with Madame Fatima, the atmosphere of the house became even more charged, as if thunder were about to strike at any second in a cloudless sky. I felt Khalid's eyes, the eldest son, following me as if they were flashlights in the dark. He said nothing, but his silence was louder than any scream of anger I had ever heard in my life. Linda, the other worker, began to pull away from me, whispering that I was playing with fire and that the walls of that palace had ears that reached all the way to the city's religious authorities. I felt fear rise in my throat every time I passed Khalid in the hallway, but at the same time, a force I couldn't explain kept me standing, with my head held high and my heart at peace. It was a strange feeling, a mixture of human dread with a divine courage that told me that, whatever happened, I was no longer alone in those immense halls of cold marble and gold. The palace seemed divided between the light entering through the cracks and the shadow trying to close all doors at any cost, and I was the center of this invisible tug-of-war that was shaking the foundations of everything. Amira, the young daughter, began to seek me out more and more, fleeing from parties and social gatherings to hide with me in the service area, where the noise of the dryers drowned out our forbidden conversations. She asked me questions that left me breathless, wanting to know details about what Jesus' life was like, if he really loved women, and if it was true that he forgave even the darkest sins someone could carry in their soul. I saw in her a hunger that no expensive food or diamond jewelry could satisfy. It was as if she were fumbling in the dark, in search of a hand to hold, and I was the only person she trusted to show the way. I told her about the Samaritan woman at the well and saw her eyes shine in a way I had never seen before in Dubai, a hope that was transforming her face day after day. We would hug in the middle of piles of towels to be washed, and I felt she was becoming my spiritual daughter, a princess of an earthly kingdom who was discovering that the true throne was God's heart. It was dangerous, it was too risky, but how could I deny bread to someone who was starving right in front of me? Meanwhile, Mr. Ahmed was changing in a way that scared even his oldest business partners, acting with an integrity and kindness that didn't fit the aggressive business world he lived in. He called me into his office several times to ask about Bible passages he found on the internet, reading secretly during the early morning with the monitor's glow illuminating his tired face marked by illness. He confessed to me that he felt like a man who had lived his whole life in a windowless room and that suddenly someone had opened a skylight in the ceiling, leaving him stunned by so much light. "Maria," he would say with a raspy voice, "how can I be a follower of Jesus if everyone expects me to be the pillar of a tradition I no longer feel?" I didn't have the answers to a billionaire's doubts. I could only say that God knew his situation and that the truth was not a prison, but a slow and constant liberation. Seeing such a powerful man humbling himself before the words of a carpenter from Galilee was the most vivid proof of the miracle I was witnessing. Something that made me forget the exhaustion of work hours and the longing for home that tore at me. Danger almost knocked on our door on a Tuesday afternoon when Khalid walked unannounced into his mother's room while I was inside, reading Psalm 91 to her in a low voice. The shock was so great that the small prayer book I had with me slipped from my hands and fell right at his feet, with the pages open showing the verses he so despised. The air in the room seemed to vanish instantly, and Khalid's gaze turned into a sharp blade, jumping from the Bible on the floor to his mother's pale face and then to mine, with a hatred that made me tremble to my last bone. Madame Fatima, with a dignity that only women of great faith possess, rose slowly, picked up the book from the floor, and held it against her chest, defying her own son with a silence that said more than any explanation. He didn't say a word, just turned around and left, slamming the door with a force that made the chandelier crystals sway, leaving a trail of threat that hung over us like a black cloud. At that moment, I knew the secret was no longer a secret, and that the storm we had been avoiding was about to break over our heads, changing the course of that story forever. The crash of the door slammed by Khalid still echoed in my ears as I saw Madame Fatima squeeze that little Bible against her chest, as if she were protecting a child from an attack. The air in the room was still, heavy with the smell of expensive incense and the pure fear rising in my throat. I was certain that this would be my last day in that house and perhaps my last day of freedom in Dubai. Madame Fatima looked at me with deep sadness and sent me to my room immediately without talking to anyone, not even Linda. I walked through the marble corridors feeling like a criminal, every shadow looking like a guard coming to take me to the airport or a dark cell. I locked the door of my little room and collapsed on the bed, sobbing softly so as not to be heard, pressing the pillow against my face while the image of my children, Carlo and Isabel, came to my mind like a goodbye. I felt the roof of that palace was collapsing over me, and the only thing I could do was whisper the name of Jesus, asking that, if I left, the seed that remained there would not die with my sudden departure. The night passed like a waking nightmare, where every noise in the hallway made me jump with fright, thinking Khalid had returned with the police or security to expel me from there. But what happened the next morning was something I could never have predicted with my limited mind full of human fear. Mr. Ahmed sent for me in his office early, and I went with my legs shaking so much I could barely climb the steps of the main staircase, feeling the weight of my destiny in every step. When I entered, he was standing by the immense window, looking at the glass buildings of Dubai shining under the strong desert sun, and the silence in the room was so great I could hear my own heart beating. He turned slowly, and to my surprise, there was no anger on his face, but a tired serenity, like that of a man who has made a decision from which he can no longer turn back. He told me that Khalid had demanded my immediate dismissal, but that he, as the head of that house and that family, had the final word. I would stay, because my presence brought something that his money could never buy for that home. That conversation with Mr. Ahmed was like a balm on an open wound, but I knew the price of that decision would be high for all of us, as the division in the family was now wide open like a wound that won't stop bleeding. He confessed to me, with a low voice and teary eyes, that Khalid was threatening to tell his uncles and the religious community about the strange influences that were changing his father's behavior. Seeing a man as powerful and influential as he, owner of companies and properties, feel cornered inside his own home because of his search for truth, made me realize that their spiritual desert was much more arid than I imagined. He asked me to be even more discreet, not to give reasons for more fights, but he begged me not to stop praying for them, as he felt his life depended on that invisible connection I had with heaven. I left that room feeling that I was no longer just an employee hired by an agency. I was a sentinel in there, guarding a secret that was protecting the soul of that family against the fury coming from outside. While the tension with Khalid grew, Amira found a way to take me to her room to show me something that left me in shock and wonder at the same time, proving that God works in secret. She had managed, through secret contacts on the internet, to download a version of the Bible in Arabic on her tablet and spent the nights reading Jesus' parables with a hunger that made her forget even to eat. She told me she had gotten in touch with a small group of Christians who met secretly in apartments in the city, people of various nationalities who risked everything to worship together in the middle of the night. Amira, the princess of that luxurious mansion, was willing to disguise herself in simple clothes and go out hidden to meet with domestic workers, drivers and laborers who served the same God she was beginning to love. Seeing that transformation from a frivolous and sad girl to a courageous woman full of purpose made me realize that God's rivers were running beneath that Dubai desert, and that no one, not even Khaled or the severest laws, could stop the flood that was coming. Amira began to live a double life that left my heart in my mouth every day, a tightrope walk between the palace and the outskirts of Dubai that defied any human prudence. She would leave home in her most expensive silk abayas, saying she was going to the mall or to meet elite friends, but in reality, she hid in ordinary cars to reach simple apartments where workers and maids gathered to worship. I helped her cover up these departures, feeling the cold sweat run down my back every time Khaled asked about his sister's whereabouts with that tone of voice loaded with suspicion. There was a night when she returned with radiant eyes, saying she had washed the feet of an African refugee during a meeting, feeling a joy that no seven-star hotel party had ever given her. That girl, who before hardly looked at those who served her, now hugged people whom the world considered invisible. And I saw in her the reflection of a freedom that was costing dearly but was worth every second of risk in that city of glass. Meanwhile, Madame Fatima was undergoing a transformation that was like the blooming of a flower in the middle of hot asphalt. She began to look at the other employees and the world outside with eyes of mercy. She would call me to her room to tell me, with a low voice full of indignation, about how her friends treated their own maids poorly, and how she now felt physical pain seeing any type of injustice. She began to use part of her personal fortune to secretly help women who had been abused by their bosses or who were imprisoned for debts they could not pay, acting as a silent angel behind the scenes in Dubai. The luxury that was once her pride now seemed like a weight, and she confessed to me that she felt much richer when she shared what she had than when she accumulated jewelry in hidden safes. It was impressive to see that powerful woman becoming a servant in spirit, learning that the true value of a life is not measured by the gold one carries, but by the love one pours over the smallest and most forgotten of the earth. Mr. Ahmed, for his part, was facing a storm in the business world that tested every fiber of his new faith, proving that following the light in the midst of darkness demands a price that few are willing to pay. He began to implement radical changes in his companies, demanding that all contracts be honest and that construction workers receive fair wages and have dignified housing conditions. This generated a silent revolt among his partners and competitors, who called him crazy or said he had softened after his illness. But he did not back down an inch. He told me he could no longer close his eyes to the exploitation that sustained the wealth of that city, and that he preferred to lose millions than lose the peace he had found in that hospital bed. The palace received calls from powerful men trying to understand what was happening, and I saw Mr. Ahmed maintain calm and integrity, acting as a beacon of justice in an ocean of greed, even knowing that his own son, Khaled, was plotting plans to remove him from command. The most sacred night I lived in that place happened when Mr. Ahmed and Madame Fatima called me to the main hall in the middle of the night, when everyone else was already asleep and the silence was absolute. They asked me to pray for them there, in the center of that room of marble and gold, the three of us together, holding hands, forming a circle that joined completely different worlds through the same spirit. The heat that took over that environment was something I cannot explain logically. It was as if the roof of the house had disappeared and the glory of God had descended upon us, ignoring our differences of class, race, or official religion. We cried together, whispering prayers that mixed my simple Tagalog with their poetic Arabic in a harmony that seemed to come directly from God's throne. At that moment, I knew we were no longer bosses and employee. We were siblings who had found the same source of living water in the middle of the world's most arid desert. That peace we felt, there was the seal that, No matter what Khalid or the world did, something eternal had been sealed in our hearts forever. But the world outside was not blind, and the changes inside that fortress of glass and marble began to leak like water through invisible cracks, attracting judgmental looks from all sides of Dubai's high society. Khalid was not just angry. He was acting in the shadows, bringing men with long beards and traditional robes to his father's office, trying to prove that Mr. Ahmed had lost his mind or been bewitched by dangerous foreign influences. I felt the whispers in the corridors, the cold looks from the security guards, and the pressure that increased every day, as if we were living inside a pressure cooker about to explode. Linda, my colleague, hardly spoke to me now, afraid that the dust from that spiritual fight would fall on her too, and make her lose her job or worse. I felt like a foreigner in two worlds. In the palace, I was the intruder who brought the light they feared. In my heart, I was the mother, counting the seconds to hug Carlo and Isabel again, but unable to abandon that family in the middle of the fire. Amira's situation became the most critical point of that silent war, as the pressure for her to marry a cousin from an influential lineage was becoming unbearable and psychologically violent. She would come to cry in my room in the middle of the night, trembling like a leaf in the wind, saying she could not give her life to a man who would hate the God she now loved above all. I would hug her there, on the floor of my small room, feeling the scent of her expensive perfume mixed with the sweat of fear, and pray softly in Tagalog so that God's angels would surround that bed and bring a way out that didn't seem to exist to human eyes. It was an immense weight to be the spiritual mother of a girl who had everything in the eyes of the world, but who was willing to lose everything because of a faith I myself had brought unintentionally. The responsibility crushed me, made me feel small and incapable, but every time I looked at her face, I saw a strength that didn't come from her, a courage that only those who found the pearl of great price can have in the middle of the highest sacrifice. The end of my 2-year contract was approaching like an inevitable shadow, and I found myself torn between the joy of returning to Mindanao and the agony of leaving those children in the faith alone among the wolves that surrounded them. Mr. Ahmed and Madame Fatima began to treat me with a tenderness that made me cry in corners. They knew I was the bridge that connected them to something new and feared that, with my departure, the connection might weaken or break completely. I spent nights preparing Rodrigo through messages, saying I was almost home, but my heart grew tight, seeing Mr. Ahmed reading the Bible hidden with a magnifying glass, trying to absorb every word before I was no longer there to explain the simplest details. I realized that my mission there was not to be a teacher, but to be the example that God does not need palaces to dwell. He dwelt in me, a poor woman, and that was what they wanted to keep for themselves. Homesickness fought against love for those souls, and I felt I was leaving a piece of my life behind in the sand of Dubai and in their souls. I remember one night in particular, a few weeks before my departure, when the Dubai air was cooler and the scent of jasmine in the garden was so strong it seemed to numb the pains of the exhausting workday. Madame Fatima called me to help her put away some jewelry, and suddenly she stopped, looked at her own reflection in the gold mirror, and said she had never felt as beautiful as now, not because of the precious stones, but because of the peace shining in her eyes. She took a thin necklace from her neck and placed it in my hands, saying it was not a payment, but a reminder that our souls were now intertwined by a secret the world would never logically understand. In that instant, the luxury of that room seemed to disappear, and I saw only a sister in Christ, a woman who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death beside her husband and who had found eternal life in the process. I felt a shiver of gratitude for having been the instrument used by God to touch that life, understanding that every tear of loneliness I cried in that palace had been a seed watered for this moment. In my last week in Dubai, the Al Rashid mansion seemed to be submerged in a state of permanent vigil, a silence that was not of absence, but of a profound transformation that now needed to learn to breathe alone without my constant presence. Amira sought me out in the laundry area for the last time, a place that became our secret sanctuary between the steam of the machines and the sweet smell of fabric softener, her face marked by crying and her hands trembling. She handed me a white envelope with my name written in delicate calligraphy, asking with an almost inaudible whisper that I only open it when the plane wheels left the ground of those sandy lands. I hugged her with a strength that came from the soul, feeling that I was leaving a spiritual daughter in the middle of an invisible battlefield, but with the absolute certainty that the God she now served was infinitely more powerful than any tradition or law that tried to stifle her new faith. The warmth of that hug, mixed with the rhythmic sound of the dryers in the background, sealed an alliance that went far beyond boss and employee. We were now two women united by a mystery that defied all logic and security of that palace of cold marble and gold. Mr. Ahmed and Madame Fatima called me to their private office for our official farewell, and what I found there was the greatest trophy I could take back to Mindanao, something infinitely more valuable than any financial bonus they could deposit in my account. I no longer saw the arrogant and distant bosses I met 2 years prior. Before me were two people who carried a sacred mark on their soul, a softness in their manner and a transparency in their gaze that only those who found the true light can reflect so impactfully and purely. Mr. Ahmed held my hands with a respect that made me tremble inside and told me, with a voice choked by life's weariness and the soul's joy, that I had been the living answer to a prayer he didn't even know how to formulate, opening a spiritual door he never knew existed in his world of billions. Madame Fatima hugged me for a long time, breaking all social and cultural protocols that rule that city of ostentation, and whispered in my ear that we were now sisters for eternity, linked by a secret that the walls of that palace would keep in absolute and reverent silence. The day of my final departure was a blur of intense emotions, with the scorching Dubai sun shining fiercely over the dark glass of the luxury cars parked at the mansion's entrance, while I said goodbye to every corner of that place that was at the same time my prison and my sanctuary. Even Khalid appeared for the final goodbye, maintaining a cold and calculated distance, but he extended his hand in a stiff greeting that I knew was the maximum recognition he could give to the woman who, from his point of view, had messed up all the order and tradition of his home. Linda and the other employees watched from afar with looks that mixed silent relief and a touch of melancholy for the freedom I was regaining, without imagining that true freedom was staying there, planted in the hearts of those who now read the Bible in the secret of the dawn. I got into the car with Amira, feeling the cold leather of the seat, and looking back through the rear window as the silhouette of that white stone palace grew smaller on the horizon, carrying with me the feeling that the desert had bloomed in a way no one there would know how to logically explain or rationalize until the end of their days. When the plane finally took off and the twinkling lights of Dubai became just distant golden dots in the middle of the desert's immense darkness, I opened Amira's letter and cried uncontrollably, ignoring the curious and uncomfortable looks of the other passengers in that cramped cabin. She wrote with a cutting honesty that I had saved her existence, that before my arrival she was just a rich and empty shadow wandering through gold corridors, but that now she possessed an eternal reason to live and a real God to love, even if in the absolute secret of the modern catacombs of that city. I landed in Manila with a light soul, feeling the damp, warm air of the Philippines embrace me as if the earth itself were welcoming me home after an exhausting and victorious battle in foreign territory. Arriving at my small barangay and seeing the simple bamboo walls of my little house running to the desperate embrace of Rodrigo, Carlo, and Isabel, I realized that all the luxury I left behind was just straw compared to the spiritual wealth I now carried within my spirit. I was just a simple woman from Mindanao, but I returned home as the guardian of a miracle that proved God uses the humblest things to confound the powerful, and that the seed in the desert always finds its way to the light. Months have passed since I stepped on Mindanao soil again, but the silence of that palace in Dubai still echoes in my mind like a mystery that my own soul refuses to fully file away. Here, the chickens cackle at dawn, and the smell is of wet earth and fresh fish, an absolute contrast to the icy air conditioning and the scent of sandalwood that permeated the Al Rashid silk curtains in the desert. Sometimes I find myself touching the small gold cross that Madame Fatima gave me in secret, feeling the relief of the metal on my work-calloused fingertips, and a shiver runs down my neck, remembering that night in the hospital. I look at my simple house, at the walls Rodrigo fixed with the money I sent with such sweat, and I realize that the Maria who left here to earn a living returned with something that no currency exchange can convert into cash. The experience simply happened, without warning, without preparation, leaving in me a mark that is like a scar of light that doesn't hurt, but reminds me every day that the laws of medicine and human logic are too small to contain what I saw and felt in those early morning hours. I receive messages from Amira on my phone from time to time, short words loaded with a meaning that only the two of us understand, telling me how her father now treats employees with a dignity that shocks even the richest neighbors in the region. She told me that Mr. Ahmed transformed the way his companies operate, prioritizing justice over profit, acting as if every business decision were an act of silent worship to this God who brought him back from the edge of the abyss. Madame Fatima now leads support groups for immigrant women, using her influence to protect those who, like me, cross the sea in search of a hope that often turns into suffering. It is strange to think that while I wash my family's clothes in the river, thousands of kilometers away, the seeds that sprouted in that desert are turning into trees that give shade to those who have nothing. Their transformation was not a passing enthusiasm, but a change of nature, something that fixed itself in the DNA of that family and continues to spread invisibly but unstoppably through the marble corridors of that palace. What leaves me most perplexed, and what to this day I cannot explain to Rodrigo or my mother without words failing me, is the absolute inability of science to give a name to what happened to Mr. Ahmed. The doctors at the most expensive hospital in Dubai, with all their modern equipment and international degrees, simply hung their heads and admitted they didn't understand how a body in multiple organ failure recovered life in a few hours of silence. They spoke of coincidence, of luck, of statistics. But Mr. Ahmed knew the truth. Madame Fatima knew the truth. And I, in my insignificance as a servant, also knew that heaven had invaded that ICU. That presence he felt, that woman he swore to have seen praying at the foot of his bed when no one was physically there, remains as the deepest point of this mystery that defies any rational explanation. It was an event that tore the veil between what we see and what is truly real, and I feel wonder every time I realize that my simple prayers, made among buckets, were the fuse for a spiritual explosion. Now, as the sun sets behind the Mindanao palms and Isabel runs to show me a school drawing, I just close my eyes and accept that there are mysteries that were not meant to be deciphered, but only lived. The experience in Dubai was not a planned script or a story with a beginning, middle, and logical end. It was a breath of God that simply happened, used me, and then ceased, leaving only the trail of the impossible behind. I no longer seek answers about why it was me or why it was in that house, for I understood that faith does not need explanations to be real. It only needs a heart willing to burn in the dark. The feeling of peace I felt in the secret garden with my boss still visits me at the most unexpected moments, bringing the same warmth I felt when the impossible became fact before my eyes. The account ends here, not because the story is over, but because human words lose meaning before the grandeur of what was lived. The rest belongs only to the sacred silence between me and the Creator. I feel at peace and awestruck by the glory of what I saw.
Do you believe that God can use the smallest thing in your life to perform a giant miracle? Share your experience or what you felt listening to this account in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe and activate notifications. This is fundamental so you don't miss the next transformative content we will bring to you. Now, click on the video appearing on the screen to continue strengthening your faith with our next recommended story. Thank you very much, and may God bless you.